I want to know the true origins of Islam. So I invited Dr. Peter Von Sivers to join me for this episode. He said, as he's been examining the origins of Islam for many decades, that there's an aspect that is not quite understood or studied on the same depth that he has in Islamic origins. And what that is the Christology and the Christianities that are in the areas of Arabia and the known world, from Rome, Persia, and down into Arabia. The Saracens and the Arabs, were they Christians? What kind of Christians? And the earliest voice within Islamic tradition is the Quran. We shouldn't trust something coming hundreds of years later to take to the bank. And Dr. Von Sivers clearly tells me, Derek, the Quran is a reaction. Pay attention closely as he educates us on the history. He knows world history, but also specifically this time period very well, on what led up to what we call Islam. We are MythVision. Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. I have a special treat, and I mean that. This is going to be highly intellectual, engaging in history, really getting to the bottom of some ideas. And so with that being said, I have a special guest, and that is Dr. Peter Von Sivers. Is it Sivers, or am I saying it correctly?
Sivers, yeah.
Sivers.
Correct.
Welcome to MythVision. How are you?
You're welcome. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you. I want everybody to know he has an academia page. Please go jump on that. I actually joined academia as well, so I have a profile. He has a profile. You definitely want to go there. Many publications he has written, and some of the stuff we're going to talk about today, you will find on his academia to dive much deeper into the data. I do want everybody to know as well that you have credentials at Salt Lake City, Utah, but you actually are an emeritus university professor on history, but not only Middle Eastern history, like world history, if I'm not mistaken, right?
That's right, yeah.
So you know a thing or two about history.
Okay, I'm a historian, a full-blooded historian, yes.
Is there anything I missed in terms of your education that you might want to highlight for our audience?
Yeah, well, I as you probably recognize from my accent, I'm originally from Germany. I studied in Munich and got my PhD there at the university. But I came already to the United States in 1968, where Gustav von Grunebaum invited me to UCLA. And since at the same time, I also found the love of my life and got married to an American who had come to Munich to learn German in order to prepare for her PhD at the University of Chicago. We got married and I started my career at UCLA. And so then I stayed in the United States.
Congratulations. Not everybody finds the one.
Okay.
What piqued your interest, if I may, as we're diving into this? Why the origins of Islam? Why was that fascinating to you?
I shortly after finishing high school, a friend and I wanted to go to Algeria, which at that time was fighting for its independence. It was impossible to get visa, and obviously it was even more difficult to get into a war zone. And so instead we ended up in Morocco. But it was so fascinating for me that when I came back to Munich, I studied then Middle Eastern studies, history, and Islam. And so that's where it all began.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for that. And I hope our audience will go down in the description. There is an episode specifically that caught my attention about Dr. Sivers. You want to check it out. It will be linked down in the description, where he gives a lecture on Islamic origins. Some of this stuff may or may not be mentioned during the episode today, but maybe there's going to be stuff we talk about that isn't mentioned in this lecture. So if you really want to take a deep dive, I really recommend you check that out, and any of the other links we have down in the description that will be there, so you can go check out the material. With that being said, today's discussion is about the backstory of Islam. the world in which Islam was born in. And to start with, I would like to have a look at the two superpowers at the time, Byzantine Empire and the Persian Empire. So let's begin with the Byzantine Empire, if I may. This is a map, just so people can kind of get a visual idea on the map what it would look like. You see the Persian Empire to the east. You have the Byzantine Empire. Constantinople's right here. You see it in the middle. Can you tell us more about this empire? When was it formed? How long did it last for? And who was the emperor during the time of what we call Muhammad?
Yeah. Well, so the Roman Empire, we actually have to call it, and scholars are debating forever when one should call it Byzantium or Byzantine Empire. I usually make the transition at around 610 when Emperor Heraclius came to power. And he was, of course, the one who was beaten by the Arabs when they conquered between or in the early 630s. And so at that time, then I say, okay, it was Byzantium. And the reason for that is that Heraclius made himself a Christian king, no longer a Roman Empire. So he changed his titles and so on. So the Roman Empire, of course, was initially pagan, but then became Christian in the waning years of the 300s. And so in the 400s and 500s, Christianity then expanded everywhere, and so including also in Syria and a good portion of Arabia and so on. So by the time, let's say the mid 500s, which would be the period where I seriously begin to look at what happened there, so that we can then understand half a century later the beginning of Islam. So in the mid 500s, the Roman Empire, everybody called it the Roman Empire. Even later than the Arabs who conquered called it Rum. And that is, of course, Rome, and stood for the Roman Empire. So it's only we scholars who call it Byzantium from about 610, or well, some call it already Byzantium in the 500s. However that may be, I mean, that's not important. The important point, however, is that in the mid 500s, in a fierce Christological debate was raging throughout the Roman Byzantine Empire concerning, when I say Christological debate, concerning what exactly was the crucifixion, who was killed on the cross, and the person on the cross, Jesus, did he suffer or did he not suffer? And so there were some Christians, we have to say, of course, when Christianity became official in the Roman Empire, there were fierce theological debates, including the nature of Jesus and so on. And then, of course, from Nicaea and later Chalcedon on, there was an Orthodox Christianity. Let me call it Chalcedonianism or the Chalcedonian Church. Chalcedon is a city in Anatolia where these doctrines were defined and then officially pronounced. So the debate in the mid 500s was the Jesus who was killed on the cross. Was he entirely divine? That was the position of the Miaphysites, or let me, because that's a very technical term, which I don't want to define. So we are not going into the natures of Christ very deeply. Let's say the Jacobites, after Jacob Bardeus, who was a proselytizer in Syria, converting the Arabs to Christianity. So we should be sure, and I do not believe at all that there were still pagans in Arabia. So there might have been lots of Arab tribes who were not very Christian, perhaps, but what else is new? How many real Christians are around today? So there's no point in quibbling about this. Arabia was Christian. Okay, so the Jacobites were the majority, and they believed they were what is called theopaschites. In other words, Jesus was nailed to the cross, but because he was, let me be a bit cavalier now with theology, he was God on earth, okay? So he was entirely divine. He had only one nature that was divine. That's what the Jacobites said. And so when he was crucified, obviously God suffered and died. That was considered to be scandalous, and efforts were made then, both in the official Christian church of the Byzantine Empire, and then also among a group condemned by those who believed in the full divinity of Christ. The so-called Eastern Syrian Church. Later they were called Nestorians. So let me call them Nestorians, even though it's anachronistic. They believed, let me briefly describe their position. They
Please.
believed that Jesus had two natures, one divine, one human. And when Jesus was nailed to the cross, only the human Christ suffered and died. The divine Jesus obviously couldn't, because God cannot be nailed to the cross, obviously. So the second position, which we might describe as, let's say, more rational, but it was very difficult to fully combine the two natures. So there were always debates on, were there two persons? Was there one person? How many natures, and so on. Let me make this brief. The people who later became the Nestorians, the Eastern Christians, were essentially pushed out. This was after Ephesus in 431. Pushed out of the Byzantine Empire and became the Christians in, now we are turning to the Sassanid Persian Empire. So they settled there and built up the Eastern Christian Church, which continued to adhere to this new nature theory. Now, again, long story short, in the course of the 500s, when these fierce debates broke out over the nature of Jesus, the main antagonists were, on one hand, the Jacobites, who believed in the single divine nature and therefore in God's suffering on the cross, were opposed by the Easterners or Nestorians, who said, no, Jesus had two natures, and it was only the human nature in Jesus that suffered and eventually died on the cross. The reason why I'm getting, and of course then there was a middle position, which the Byzantines tried to take, because of course they had a strong imperial interest in having all of the different Christian churches, essentially then from the second half of the 500s onwards, to be one, under one patriarch in Constantinople. And of course also there was the Pope or the Bishop of Rome, and also under the Roman Byzantine authority.
If I may, just to poke in as we go, because some of these images I have are related to exactly what you're talking about here. So it was the capital was Constantinople. This was the church, just so everybody knows, in Constantinople would have looked like back in the time during Muhammad, of course, without the minarets. So if you look here,
good that you took the minarets off, so that one has an impression of the Roman Byzantine period.
Exactly. And this right here, obviously, as well, I just want to show an inside look at that same church. Here you have the Christ, right? Jesus on the ceiling. And then this is one of the famous paintings we see images on Google when we're looking up Jesus. We've all seen this, I think. This is inside that very church. The art is absolutely fascinating there. So I want everybody go ahead.
While you have this image, let me point out, maybe one really would have to get close and look at the face. But the face is half human and half divine, if you look very carefully. What? So in other words, one half of the face expresses some of the suffering that Jesus experienced on the cross. The other one was the divine Jesus, who of course did not suffer on the cross. So here you have a visual presentation, a representation of this. That's the position that Chalcedon took, which is essentially that of the Eastern Christians, but not entirely so. And the reason why I mentioned this is now that the Jacobites were outraged in the course of the, and I say this deliberately, in the course of the 500s, and I want to get a little more into the details so that this becomes clear. Mm-hmm. They were outraged that both the Chalcedon, the church that tried to compromise between the two, well, let's call them extreme positions, God being entirely divine and God being half divine, half human. The fierce debate in the second half of the 500s was then culminated then in a figure, John of Tella, so he died in 538. He denounced the main person of the Eastern Syriac Church by being another Judas. So in other words, he betrayed the official Christian position according to which Jesus was crucified, according to which the Jews crucified Jesus. Now, we know better, of course, any careful reading of the Gospels makes it clear that the Romans were the ones, not the Jews. But of course, the Jews were sympathetic to the Romans taking Jesus essentially off their hands. That's the situation. Now, this John of Tella denounced Nestorius by saying he is the new Judas because he dares to say that the Jews did not kill Jesus. And therefore, he is just absolutely scandalous in the Christian church because we all know that the Jews killed him. So that was the position, the polemics of the Jacobites, and the Quran picked up the polemics and also declared, no, Jesus was not killed on the cross. It only seemed to the Jews that way. This is a crucial verse in the Quran. It's 457, I think. I made a little note here, 157, if listeners want to write this down and check in the Quran. It's a crucial verse because already in the year 437, maybe 637, maybe 640, so in the last days of the Arab conquest of Iraq, the bishop of Nisibis at that time, Adiabene, Ishayyah III, had apparently Arab conquerors who informed him what the Arabs were all about. And he said, well, we should not fear the Arabs who are in the process of conquering us, because like we, they do not believe that Jesus suffered and died on the cross. So here you have, in a nutshell, the beginning of Islam.
This is great. Okay, I'm going to keep moving here with some images here. I want everybody to take a look here at the superpower of the time, the Persian Empire. This is the map and what it looks like, what it looked like, if you will, just to give an idea. Can you tell us some more about this empire? When was it formed? How long did it last? Or who was the emperor during the time of Muhammad?
Yeah, so Iran, of course, it's a very old empire. Way back, one of the kings of Iran was even a messiah according to the Bible. Because he was responsible for resettling the Jews, releasing them from the Persian Empire, so that they could return to Jerusalem and build the Second Temple. So there you have an old connection between Iran and or the Persian kingdom and Christianity.
King Cyrus,
Cyrus, right. Now, fast forward, the Sassanians or Sassanids founded the most recent version of the Persian Empire, And in the throughout, again, the second half of the 500s, early 600s, they were in constant war with the Romans or Byzantium. And in fact, they were usually more victorious than the Romans. The Romans were quite defensive. And in the last war, the one that was led by Khosrow II, so he was then eventually the last king, because he was overthrown by the Persians themselves in 628, when the Romans finally, under Heraclius, were able to defeat him. So in 628, that was, of course, the turning point. Heraclius was victorious. Heraclius, the emperor of Byzantium, was victorious. The Persians were defeated, and so Heraclius wisely, however, because he was not completely firmly in the saddle, he had come to power only through a coup in 610. He wisely let the Persians fight it out among themselves, and of course then in the subsequent years, with a lot of turmoil among the Sassanids, eventually the Arabs were able to conquer all of Iraq and then ultimately Iran, and the last king of the Persians then was defeated. But the Persian Empire, or the Sassanid Empire, was extremely powerful in the second half of the 500s, and the Romans or the Byzantines found it very difficult to defend themselves. Now, because Iraq, so the western portion of the Sassanid Empire, was Christian in its majority, and Ctesiphon, the capital, or Madain in Arabic, was, that's a
nice I might as well just go through it so people can actually see these. Yeah.
And your viewers should actually compare it to the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, because it is just as impressive and imposing, showing you the enormous power that the Sassanids possessed. Yeah, there you have.
I wanted to show what a recreation would have looked like.
That's reconstruction, right?
Yeah, that's what it would have looked like. This is what we have left, just to give you an idea.
Yeah. Now, the Christians in Iraq, so those Eastern Christians who were denounced as followers of Judas, believing in the true nature.
Followers of Judas.
In the true nature theology of Jesus. And that was, even though it was a polemic, originally a polemicism of the Jacobites in Syria, it was picked up by the Arabs who were forming the Islam in the first decades of the 600s. If you want to, we can come back to this, quote, formation of the Quran as well. But it is important to be aware that already in 637, so in other words, about 8 years, 632 is a traditional date of the death of Muhammad. I'm not so sure, it might have been earlier, but that's a secondary question. Be this as it may, it was just a few years after the death of Muhammad. Already at that time, the Christians in Iraq knew, via Ishaya III, knew what all of these conquering Arabs were all about. In other words, they were, Christian, but maybe not quite along the official line. But who represented the official line anyway? Chalcedon, but they were contested by the Monophysites, as well as the Eastern Christians, although they were outside the empire, and so therefore they did not have any particular power political connection with the Byzantine. Nevertheless, Heraclius made an effort to re-invite the Eastern Christians into the larger church, Chalcedon. Heraclius was almost desperately concerned to bring the Christians back together, particularly after he had lost Syria to the Arabs, which happened by 640. So at that time, he was just desperate to reunite all of the Christians in order to have something to resist the Arabs. So ask me further questions.
Yeah. So during that time, there was a version around this period, if you don't mind, like a version of what we call COVID-19. It was the Justinian Plague, which caused huge devastation across the empire. Can you tell us more about this plague and the scale of the devastation this pandemic caused?
Yeah. One cannot draw any particular connection between the plague and the Christological developments that we have just been talking about. Nevertheless, it happened at the time of Justinian, and Justinian was also, like Heraclius, already at that time, so 550 years or 70 years earlier, very concerned about either keeping Christianity together or getting all of the Christian denominations back together. And so it was right in the middle of his tenure that the Justinian Plague occurred. We are still not exactly sure from where it came. Belief now is, so here I'm putting on the hat of the world historian, so to speak. Okay. Historians think maybe that it came from East Asia, but that is still debatable. Furthermore, it's also not completely clear how that plague developed, because, of course, we know one form of the Black Death is connected with rats. Another form is transmitted directly and doesn't need the rats. So whatever the background there, it was, of course, devastating in the middle of the second half of the 500s. But it was a first cycle. We don't know how many were killed, but what is important is there were repetitive cycles reaching way into the 700s. And an interesting detail here is that the Umayyads, the first Khalifa dynasty who came to power in 660, they suffered these periodic recurrences of the Justinian Plague. And instinctively, they knew that they shouldn't stay in the cities on the coast of Syria, or in the interior. So we're talking about Caesarea, Damascus, Jerusalem, Hems, whatever. They shouldn't stay in the cities, but should go into the clean air of the desert, where the, quote, vapors of the Black Death wouldn't hit them. And that's actually part of the background for the Umayyads having these wonderful castles in the Syrian desert that are architectural jewels. Also the paintings there. I mean, we all think that Islam is aniconic or against images, but the Umayyads were great lovers of frescoes, even of the naked body and of banquets and what have you. So that's the result of the recurrent cycles, so every 20, 30 years. And eventually the Black Death petered out only in maybe the 720s, 30s. So we can assume that the overall population in Syria and in the Eastern Mediterranean was considerably reduced. In fact, this Black Death actually reached also as far as Western Europe. So it was quite devastating.
Wow. Okay, so now we're getting back into zooming in from world history back into what's going on with this development. And I actually, it wasn't too long ago, interviewed Dr. Michael Penn. I don't know if you know.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So we talked about this, and he mentioned the largest church in the Middle East was the Church of the Syriac Christian, and they within themselves had different sects. So if I can, I'd like to show a few examples of like these different kinds of sects. And I might have a hard time pronouncing this. You can help me here. But the Monophysitism, is that how you say it?
Monophysitism.
Monophysitism. Yeah. And what is this doctrine? What are they teaching?
Okay, so here we are back to what I was talking about a little earlier, the Jacobites. So the Monophysites in Syria were called Jacobites.
Okay.
They were also predominant in Egypt, and there we call them also Monophysites. I prefer the term Myophysites, okay, rather than mono. Maya means one. Mono is already a sort of a compromise that was concluded at the beginning of the 500s by Severus, who was Bishop of Antioch. He also he was inclined toward this reconciliation that Justinian wanted to bring about, and so there were periodic efforts by the emperors and the patriarchs of Constantinople to bring those Monophysites or Myophysites or Jacobites. These are all identical.
Right. Just like the Saracens and the Arabs and
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. And the Tayyai, by the way. And so there we go. So the periodic efforts by the emperors to bring those Monophysites or Myophysites back into the fold, but then the Myophysites always resisted very strongly, and sometimes they were, or most of the times, they were aggressively opposed to both the Chalcedonians, or the main imperial church.
That would be these people. It seems on the far left. Two unified natures.
Chalcedon, two is the far left, yeah. Okay, let's stick with this picture for a moment.
Yes.
I try to avoid this business about two natures, one nature, and so on, by saying Christians who said Jesus had only one nature, and that's, of course, the far right, divine, which in many ways is the, how should we call it, the most natural attitude anyone would take towards Jesus, because any person one looks at obviously has only one nature. I mean, we are talking now here, and I presuppose in my conversation with you that you are not split into two natures.
Right.
So the common sense attitude is Jesus could have only had one nature, and of course, if you have to choose between the two, he had to have a divine nature. That's the most natural position one could take. And so therefore, that was the reason why the Myophysites or the Jacobites were so attractive in the 500s, and why they had so many supporters, and why the Chalcedonian Church was so much on the defensive. Now, the one people with the what is called here
two separate natures.
Two separate nature Nestorian. Unfortunately, this is wrong. Nestorianism does not talk about two separate natures. It talks about also, it talks about two natures, but it talks about one person in whom these two natures came together. So that is very different. And obviously, it's as close as these guys with the two nature people could come to the idea that the common sense approach that anybody would take is that Jesus was divine. Nevertheless, it was very important for the Nestorians to say, now wait a minute. It is incredibly important that Jesus had a human nature, because otherwise we cannot explain the suffering and death of Jesus on the cross. And anyone who is not prejudiced and reads the Gospels, particularly Matthew, well, Mark just as much, is struck how human Jesus is in the Gospels. In fact, I grew up as a Lutheran Protestant. For me, it was completely natural that Jesus was primarily human and only secondarily divine, because how could he have saved me or the other Protestants? How could he have saved us, unless he had sacrificed himself? So you can see here how one's feelings are torn, really, between the one and the other Jesus. And so I'm commenting here, by the way, very sympathetically about theological positions, you see.
Right.
I'm not talking about a historian in this particular case. I'm talking here about very neutrally about why it is that we on one hand, want to be Jesus, to be human, but on the other hand, why it is also very important that he is divine. Now, back to the 500s, because the Monophysites or the Jacobites were so aggressive, we can say, in an overall sense, there was a development in antiquity. So from 30, when we assume Jesus was crucified, 32, 70, when the Jewish uprising was violently suppressed by the Romans and all of the Jews were driven out of Jerusalem. From that period on, in all antiquity, the more aggressive development was towards the divinization of Jesus. So Islam came at the culmination when this divinization process occurred. And Islam is, of course, the backlash. Okay, Jesus was made human again. Now, the Nestorians were the ones who had engaged in the backlash already much earlier. But they were, of course, driven out into the Persian Empire. And so therefore, they were ineffective in the Byzantine Empire. That is why the Jacobites and Monophysites were so powerful in Syria. And it is very clear, and I cited this issue, at the beginning with this famous verse already in 437, that indicates there was an awareness of what is called theopathism, that is, God died on the cross and suffered before he died. That position was victorious, really. But Islam is a counter-reaction to this.
So technically, if I may, I'm a lay person. I really just barely am scratching the surface here. And I'm wanting to know if I'm right. So this gentleman here, Heraclius, who is like literally desperate, decides he's going to reach over to the eastern side, or really it's the western side of the Persian army or empire, where this is the king who gets end up usurped and whatnot, and get these, what we keep calling, let me get this image back up here, the Myophytes.
No, he wanted to get the Nestorians.
Okay.
The
middle, even though this isn't completely accurate, it's still, he's trying to get the Nestorians to come back. And so there's all of this theological war going on, but also political. You can't divorce the two. They're one and the same. And here is these Arabs who are actually going along with making, it's a reaction to divinity, to the point where, no, he is not a son of God. No, he is not God. God is not, do not make Jesus God at all. So it's reactionary, completely reactionary.
Exactly. Yeah.
Wow.
So this is what my, by the end of the year, I hope I will be finished with the manuscript of my book. That is where my book begins. And that is why if I'm maybe proud for a moment of my research, that is why I think I have something important new to say that no scholar who is writing at the same time, and particularly the scholars whom you have interviewed, because in many ways they are also trying to present a new picture. Mm-hmm. And I'm definitely presenting a new picture, and so that's what I'm after.
Wow. Okay, let's keep going, because there's so many good things. I have so many questions. I would like to move on to the border patrols, if you don't mind, because we're talking about the differences, and you did a wonderful job explaining that. I was going to ask, is there any other group of Christians that we didn't mention that might be, just before we left, that are not really popular, aren't really mentioned, but they're there? And the reason I ask, in light of this, all of these groups you're talking about, are they all using the canonical text? Because it seems like there's awareness of literature in the Quran, like pseudepigraphical literature, that I thought that was extinguished. I thought that in the 300-400s, they had gone around and completely destroyed all of this heretical literature. But I'm seeing Jesus turn clay birds into life. Like, what's going on? Is that literature still around? And what groups of Christians maybe are reading this?
Oh, yeah. No, that literature was definitely around. You're right, of course. Once Christianity was adopted in the Roman Empire, so the late 300s, and once the great proselytization conversion efforts of the Christian Church had been completed, and that was in the course of the 400s, the Christian Church, the Chalcedonian Church in Constantinople, was successful in suppressing literature that it considered to be unorthodox. So whatever the patriarch and the emperor decided did not fit into the canon was suppressed, and it went underground. But of course, there were lots of Christians in the East who continued reading them, continued even writing such so-called questionable texts. There was then also the Judeo-Christians for a while, that is, Jews who nevertheless recognized Jesus as the Savior, but continued to practice Jewish customs and laws. So all of this went on, and we should be very much aware that the Orthodox dictate, so to speak, by the emperors and the patriarch in Constantinople was by no means successful. And so that is quite understandable. But let me mention also, since you asked a little earlier about, is there any other Christian group that is of relevance? Let me mention it. And that is, again, this is new. Nobody has really written about it. We were talking earlier about Justinian and the Justinian Plague. Justinian, as I said, was, well, I exaggerated, was desperate, but we want to
get the point.
we want to make it a little livelier here, to bring the Christians together. So he dictated a piece of liturgy which is called the Thrice Holy, 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 which is sung in the regular liturgy of Chalcedon. Well, the middle verse was at the behest of you can see here again how important the Monophysites were. At the demand, not behest really, I mean, they were really insistent on this. It was changed, and this middle liturgy was sung, Holy, Holy, who was sacrificed for us. Now, if you listen to that liturgy, it means God was sacrificed, suffered and was sacrificed on the cross, because God is the holy, 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 holy God. So the middle verse, therefore, then, officially in the Chalcedonian Church from Justinian onwards, had to be sung that way. So, just in passing, we are not talking about highfalutin two nature and one person and what have you theologies. And this is so unfortunate because you cannot really represent it accurately, like your graph showed. It's not very accurate. So I want to bring it down to earth. The people in church, when they went to Mass, either daily or on Sundays, literally sang that God on earth, so to speak, who was Jesus, was suffered on the cross and died. That was sung every day. Now you can see here why the reaction of the Muslims was so visceral, because later on, because of what I call the backlash. Because of course, in the late 500s, early 600s, when everybody had to sing it that way, including Chalcedonians, we have to be aware that that some of the bishops and monks of Jerusalem were vehemently opposed to the singing of what is called the Trisagion, the Holy, 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 with the middle verse. So in Jerusalem, there was a furious resistance in the clergy and among monks. In the 620s, early 30s, Bishop Sophronius is very crucial here, the one who actually turned the keys of Jerusalem over to Omar, who was the caliph at the time conquering it. So they were furiously opposed to the singing of the God is divine and suffered liturgy. So we have actually a complication here in Jerusalem. And I'm saying, yeah, that was picked up by the Arabs of southern Syria. So here we are turning to something we haven't mentioned yet, and that is the Christians of southern Syria and adjacent northwestern Arabia had a capital, Petra, of course, famous for its the ruins which one can visit in Jordan. Petra was probably, cannot be proved without some doubts, but probably was the city in the vicinity of which Muhammad, if we think that he was the unnamed preacher in the early 600s, where he received the beginning of the Quran, the early revelations. So he received them in Petra, not in Mecca. Mecca did probably not even exist. The first time it was ever mentioned as existing dates to 692. So this is way later. In Apocalypse, the so-called Edessene Apocalypse, that was published at that time at the end of the 600s, when the conquests were long over and Islam was beginning to form. So if we assume that the earliest revelations came to a preacher, later called Muhammad, but unnamed in the early or in many portions of the Quran. I shouldn't say early, by the way, because I don't believe in it either. But that's a different point. You can ask me about that later.
Okay.
So if we assume that an unnamed preacher lived in Petra or environs, I call the area Madian, or the Romans called it Palestina Tertia, the third Palestine. Madian is the old biblical description, because the Midianites, of course, are very important in the Old Testament. In that particular area where I think the Quran was revealed, and where the particular Arabic that the Quran represents was developed, I mean, that's where it originated. Probably in the 500s. Marijn van Putten might have told you about that, although I don't know. I mean, that's one of his points, although he is not at all in favor of the Madian theory that I mentioned. Anyway, if the Quran indeed began there, it is very likely that this early preacher, of whom we have to think that he was highly sophisticated theologically, so he had read not only the canonized Gospels, but also the suppressed literature. One basic methodological principle always, apart from working only with historically verifiable record, is that one should always think of protagonists being of the highest sophistication. They are never dumb or uneducated. So Muhammad, this nameless preacher in some portions of the Quran, clearly has to be supposed to be fully familiar, including the Jerusalem patriarchs or bishops who opposed the Trisagion. So in other words, in a way, Jerusalem was Nestorian. And that's why I am so interested in this connection of what the Nestorians had to say about Jesus suffering and dying on the cross, not God suffering. That's why it is so interesting that this Jerusalem position is exactly the position that then reappears in the Quran, because the Quran is not entirely clear about whether there wasn't also a divinity in Jesus. If one carefully reads the particular verse that speaks about the Jews did not kill Jesus, it does not deny that that Jesus was not divine. It merely says the divine Jesus couldn't be killed, and that's why the Jews were wrong. So that's a completely different position. So that's why it is so important to say, okay, Petra is part of the picture, and that's where the early revelations began. And we don't even know whether there was any Meccan connection. It could be that this preacher in way north, eventually in 620, 622, that's of course when the rise of Medina begins. That's the famous Hijrah, that he made a Hijrah from the north to Medina, not from Mecca. And that Mecca came into existence only later, perhaps by dissidents from Medina. But that's a different story, and that's a bit speculative, and I don't want to go into.
This is fascinating. I'm going to keep going because some of the stuff you're mentioning is relevant to what we're going to get into, and I'll have more questions, of course, as well. So let's move to the border patrols real quick between these two empires, what we call Byzantium or Byzantine and Persian, real quick here, just to give people a visual. And I'm going to probably butcher the names, but I'm going to try the Ghassanids.
Well, in Arabic, you would say Ghassanids.
And the Lakhmids.
And the Lakhmids,
Lakhmids, who were Romanized Arabs and personalized Arabs. And we have an inscription for these Romanized Arabs from 568 AD in southern Syria. But before I show those inscriptions, here's a modern day analogy for our viewers so they can understand. And I want them to see this little post here. This is Arabic and French, the sign. Here is that sign in Lebanon right now, which is in French and Arabic. As Lebanon was under the French rule, and in Lebanon, French is their second language. Likewise, I'm going to show you an inscription in South Assyria from these Romanized Arabs, and this is something that I believe was in Robert Hoyland's work, just to give people the inscriptions on the wall here, but also here it is in black and white, so you can actually read what's going on. And you can see on the left the inscription in Greek, and on the right in Arabic. Can you tell us more about these Romanized Arabs, the Ghassanids, if I will? When were they formed? How long were they around for? Who was their leader during the time of Muhammad?
Yeah. Well, the long centuries of war between the Roman Empire and the Persians, of course, required that both empires had to think about how would they fortify their borders in order to discourage either side from attacking. And so initially the Romans built, of course, the famous limes, Limes. There is a scholarly debate about how much the Romans thought of it as being a defensive bulwark. I don't want to get into this, too specialized, but let's say it was sort of a buffer area where there were lots of forts and, of course, also well-built roads where the Roman soldiers could march and so on. So that was the initial way of defending themselves against the Persians. The Persians, because they were usually the attackers, before then they were beaten back, they did not build a huge fortification. They relied right from the start on these so-called Lakhmids. And they were Arabs who were then, of course, Christianized. They became the Nestorians, about whom we have been talking before. So they had a capital there, Hira, which is right there on the western border today of Iraq, where actually the Sassanids encouraged the emergence of a kingdom. And so the Lakhmid kings were quite powerful. And in the course of the 500s, again, we are talking here about Justinian. Justinian was the decisive person there, although he was not the first one who made that decision. Justinian decided that it was too expensive to maintain the limes because he had to have troops in these fortifications in the watchtowers. Troops had to be stationed there and exchanged. They had to be paid, etc., etc. So he decided that it would be probably much cheaper to turn over the defense, similar to what the Persians did with the Lahmids, to the Ghassanids. So the Ghassanids emerged in the course of the 500s, but when Syria became Christianized, the Ghassanids became Jacobites. Here we are again with the Monophysites. And so they were a defensive force whom the Romans supported, gave important titles to. They became what is called phylarchs. And eventually, even in the middle of the 500s, they became kings as well, or were called that way. And let them fight it out among themselves before then either the Persians or the Romans would have to interfere with their own troops. So that is what happened also in the second half of the 500s. And it's extremely important, this development, because, of course, it helped the Christianization of the Arabs. But again, you see, I'm insistent here, it's not just that they became Christian, it's that they became Mythophysites. And the Quran is forever attacking the Mythophysites in it. So you can see here, this is this backlash phenomenon that I mentioned a little earlier. The Quran speaks about what is called in Arabic mushrikun, literally meaning those who associate God with other beings. This is simply the Arabic term for the Mythophysites, because you see, Muhammad was a preacher when he received his revelations. He was just like the people who went to church and listened to or sang the Trisagion. He did not write theological treatises. He wrote a homiletic text collection. In other words, he preached it to the Arabs in probably Petra or environs, Midian, as I said a little earlier. So anywhere there in northwest Arabia. He preached it to them, and the Ghassanids were the ones who were the mushrikun, who associated other beings with Jesus. So the Quran is really a backlash against the mushrikun, those who add people to God, and that means Jesus and the Holy Spirit. There is no Trinity. That is the strong backlash position that you find represented in the Quran.
Wow. Okay. So we got the Lahmids and the
Ghassan. It's like it's not a sound you have in the English language.
Yeah.
But you pronounce it way deep, like the French would pronounce their
Hassanids.
Yeah,
Hassanids.
Okay.
They played a role in the rise of Islam, as you said. Did their military learn skills from the two superpowers, Persia and Rome? I know this is probably a silly question, but a lot of Islamic biographies, the Arabs are seen as kind of the underdogs who were up against these two superpowers, and their victories were because of God, right? And like I talked about before the show, I'm looking to not deal with the theology, but unmask and figure out like what actually was on the ground, that God was on their side, but that they did it all by themselves. It's almost like when we read biblical narrative where it's like, it seems like the Israelites just sometimes even just stood there and God did the war for them. Hard to believe that this is true. But did they actually join forces? Like, did they have help with them from these other superpowers or potentially from other people in their wars and conquering and stuff?
Oh, yeah. The Romans used primarily foot soldiers. They had, of course, also their cavalry, but the Ghassanids were practically only cavalry. And so they were a very useful supplement to the Roman army. And that's why when they fought, they were very proud In fact, they were so proud that in 580, 81, the Romans even decided, the Byzantines even decided, well, we have to cut these Ghassanids down a notch or two. And they ended the phylarchy. Usually historians interpret this as a major mistake that the Byzantines committed, because it allowed the Lakhmids to develop their superiority in the years after the 580s. Nevertheless, they remained critical, the Ghassanids, critical all the way up to Heraclius, when he began in 610 the War of Liberation from the Persians. They were enrolled and played a major part in this War of Liberation that Heraclius led. And in fact, there's even a scholar, you might actually also try to interview him, Tesei, Tommaso Tesei, Tesei is his last name. He's now with a Korean university, but I think he is, I don't know whether he's Italian-based now or still in the United States, but he's associated with this Korean university. If you Google him, I'm sure you can find him. So Tesei is his last name, Tesei, Tommaso, Thomas.
Oh, okay.
He has written quite a bit about this critical role of the Ghassanids. He thinks that they were very important for this. Have you come across this famous verse according to which allegedly, in quotation marks, Muhammad, okay, the nameless preacher, issued a prophecy shortly before the Hijrah of 622, that the Romans were victorious now, that is in 628. When I say a prophecy is always issued after the facts have happened. Okay?
Ex eventu.
Exactly. So he prophesied that initially the Persians would be successful, but ultimately the Romans would be victorious. This verse, as I said, allegedly a prophecy, is always taken as meaning that the unnamed preacher, Muhammad, predicted that eventually the Romans would be victorious. And so therefore, the implication is the people in Mecca were sympathetic toward the Romans and not the Persians. We have not a shred of evidence about that. That is historically undocumented. In fact, it was probably the other way around. So in other words, it said that eventually the conquering Arabs would defeat the Byzantines, and indeed they did in 636. So the new reading of the Quran, which is not original with me, I mean, it's well known, but scholars are divided whether they should read it as this prophecy about the Persians being defeated and the Romans eventually, or the other way around. That is what Tesei has researched. And this is important because in 622 then, when the Hijrah happened, and then in the subsequent years until the official date of Muhammad's death in 632, so 10 years later, these were the years, 10 years, of gradual conquests by Medina, beginning with the surroundings of Medina, Mecca perhaps. We are not sure about this. We have not a shred of proof. The only thing that the Quran says is that there was an encounter by the people of Medina and the people of Mecca in the valley of Mecca. That's the only mention that the word Mecca has in the Quran. And that ultimately, of course, the people of Medina prevailed. Anyway, the important point here is when this gradual expansion of Medina occurred, somewhere around 629, it's very difficult to determine exactly, a messenger was sent to the Ghassanids telling them, give up your version of Christianity, adopt ours, because the message that Muhammad preached was there's only one God, and that Jesus was a prophet, and whether he was killed or not, as the Quran says, that is unknown. So it was not yet clear at this time, 629, what the situation was. So he sent a messenger up to these Christian Ghassanids, telling them, join us against the Romans, and we together conquer Rome, because it's the promised land. The Jews have forfeited Jerusalem. The Romans have conquered it, but now we are coming and we are conquering Jerusalem from the Romans. Help us, be our associates. So that was the functioning, the final function of the Ghassanids. They helped the conquering Medinans in the 630s to conquer Syria.
Wow. This is something that you don't hear every day. Okay,
Nope.
okay. So let's dive a little deeper here, if you don't mind. Now
Yeah.
I'd like to move on to the possibility of the location of Mecca and Medina not being in modern-day Saudi Arabia, but somewhere else. And I have some early sources which I found in Robert Hoyland's Seeing Islam as Others Saw It that I'd like to show. The first is about Mecca, and this is found in the Byzantine Arab Chronicle 741. And this one right here, he came finally to Mecca, the home of Abraham, as they think, which lies between Ur of the Chaldees and the city of Haran, Karas, in the desert. So, if I may, where exactly is the location of Mecca as described in this chronicle? And here's a map to give you kind of something to maybe go off of.
Yeah.
Do you have an idea, or?
Well, let's see here.
I know you gotta get the glasses on.
Get my glasses, yeah. The map actually shows Hira, to which I referred a little earlier. Mm-hmm. That was the capital of the Lahmids. Right. And as I said, the Lahmids were, well, let's be loose here in one's nomenclature, Nestorians. So the ones who believed in the half divine, half human nature of Jesus. They did not play any direct part in the whole conquest. So it's only the Ghassanids, to whom I referred a little earlier, because they participated in the Medinan army in the 630s in the conquest of Syria from the Romans.
Okay. I just switched maps to maybe give you a better, because the names are there, the Ghassanids or whatever, and the Lahmids. On the left or western side, you see the Ghassanids are the top left western part of Saudi Arabia, if you will.
Yeah.
Okay.
So back to this quotation that you showed me in the Chronicle of 741, which is very important, because we have, for these early years after the completion of the Arab conquest of Syria, no reliable sources for the Arabs. We have only Christian sources commenting on the conquering Arabs. And there, by the way, we are opening also an extremely interesting chapter about which you might want to ask me later. But this chronicle where you mentioned this quote, shows that the Christians of this period who reported about it, now the Chronicle of 741 is already a chronicle of 40 years after the first mentioning of Mecca. I said earlier, we don't have any proof that Mecca existed during the 600s. It is mentioned once, but only in the Quran, only in the form of in the valley of Mecca. So that does not mean that there was a city or a sanctuary. we only can indirectly conclude that perhaps there was a sanctuary because the valley of Mecca was the place where the Quran says that the Medina people met and were about to battle the Mecca people, but God interfered and withheld the Meccans from attacking because they were also sympathizers for Muhammad in Mecca, and therefore he didn't want to have any blood to be spilled. That's essentially this particular verse that I'm referring to.
Okay.
That's all we know. So we know about Mecca then eventually through this Edessene apocalypse, 692, and then subsequently, and this source of 741 clearly shows it, Christians knew that there was a Mecca. Now, the Christians of the 600s who commented on the conquering Arabs after 640 knew nothing about Mecca. A first inkling that there was something going on there, way south, north of Medina, came only in 683 when there was a counter-caliph who disputed the power with the Umayyads. And he allegedly was in this place in the south, but it's not named, where there was a sanctuary. So we know that there was a sanctuary in the south, north of Medina. That's about all. And Hoyland, who showed you this particular source, was a bit late here. 741 is already way beyond the original emergence of Islam. So that's when we can say, okay, at that time, yes, there was a Mecca, there was a Medina, there was an Umayyad Caliphate. It was the dominant one in the Middle East, and so on. And Hoyland has written quite a good book about it. I'm using it quite a bit, but he nowhere goes into the details about the Monophysites, the Nestorians, et cetera, et cetera.
So let's probe a little deeper here, because I also have a description of where the Arabs were located from a Frankish chronicle written in 650 AD, where exactly is the location of the Saracens is described in this chronicle. So let me show you that. This one right here, and it says the Hagarenes, if I'm saying that right, the Hagarenes.
Yeah, that's another name, by the way, for the Arabs, after Hagar, the slave wife of Abraham.
I'd like to get into that a little bit too, if we have the time. The Hagarenes, who are also called Saracens, which were also the Arabs, a circumcised people, which quite interesting as well. That kind of tells you something. Who of old had lived beneath the Caucasus on the shores of the Caspian in a country known as Ercolia. And I think I figure I just show the map again to give you, is there a way to describe where that would be on this map? Or maybe I go to this map. Where would it be describing?
Okay, you would have to go into, let's say, the northwestern border of, it says actually, if your readers can read it, Albania. You see that right next to the Caspian Sea.
I'm looking now.
So it would be between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea.
Okay.
And there it says on the coast of the Caspian Sea, Albania.
Got it.
Okay. That's where roughly this particular source locates them. That has to do a lot with apocalyptic speculations at that time. That's again another chapter, the famous Alexander legend up there in the northwest. So yes, there were lots of Christian speculations in the 600s and 700s, particularly in the apocalypses that became quite numerous in the early 700s. There's a lot of speculation then about where the different places are to be located. There's, of course, also the famous early map that allegedly locates Mecca under the name of Makuraba. Have you come across that?
No.
Oh, there's also long speculations about that. So the so-called Ptolemaic map But the upshot of all of this is there's not a shred of evidence about where to locate all of that. Very vague knowledge in the 600s. I'm at the point now, also I published, or in the process of publishing 2 articles on this. Even though the Arabs had completed the conquest of Syria in 640, nobody knew at the time that these conquering Arabs had a person by the name of Muhammad who was their prophet. They knew the name Muhammad, but they always described him as a king or a military leader. Perhaps he was. Shoemaker is making a big point of that Muhammad was allegedly alive when the beginning of the conquest in Syria occurred. But Shoemaker is, in my opinion, dead wrong when he says that there was already a text at that time, perhaps 634 or maybe following years around 640, the famous or infamous Doctrina Jacobi. Did he mention it?
Yeah, we've talked about it. Yes, sir.
Yeah. That mentions the Prophet Muhammad. But there are very good reasons to say the Doctrina Jacobi does not come or was not composed in these early years, in the 630s, but instead probably between, let's say, 670, 695 in Carthage, because Carthage during these years, 670 to 695, was hanging on to the city by their fingernails to save it from the conquering Arabs. That's when it was written. Anti-Judaism was extremely powerful in the course of the 600s. And did any of your viewees mention Sebios?
Yes.
The bishop? Okay.
Yes.
I have great doubts about him. That text, of course, comes from the 660s. He mentions Muhammad, but he does not say he was a prophet. That's very important.
If I may, just for the sake of the show, just so everybody understands, here it is.
Good.
For the first time in Armenian, someone talks about Muhammad and mentions him by name and says a little bit about what he did. Sebios himself was talking about the events around the year 630, which was before Muhammad had actually died.
Sebios gives a surprisingly accurate account of Muhammad's background and teachings.
Translating from the Armenian. At that time, a certain man whose name was Mahmet, which is the usual name for Muhammad in Armenian, a merchant, as if by the command of God, appeared to them as a preacher. Now, Muhammad gave them laws, namely, not to eat carrion, not to drink wine, not to speak falsehood, and not to engage in fornication.
Is that Thompson?
It is.
Okay. Yeah. I'm using his translation. Well, he had, of course, colleagues also in the process of making Sebios available. His edition or translation of the text is extremely important, and I use it all the time, and I find it very helpful. What Thompson doesn't mention is Sebios can be doubted because he is, of course, the one who says that the Arabs conquered Jerusalem because they considered it the promised land. And I mentioned it briefly earlier in our discussion. My feeling is that he wrote that, or that he, let's put it in quotation marks, invented that particular aspect of his description of the rise of Muhammad and the Arabs, which, by the way, is embedded also in an apocalyptic thinking. Sebios thought that the world would come to an end very soon. Mm-hmm. That in these last times, the Arabs were destined by God to conquer Jerusalem because the Jews had forfeited it, because they killed Jesus, The Romans had lost it because they lost the war. Heraclius was defeated. We now, the Arabs, the Arabs, Sabios, of course, talks about the Arabs as an Armenian. Armenians, by the way, were Monophysites, very important here also to consider in this whole attitude that Sabios took, because Sabios was very anti-Jewish. So in my opinion, he invented this entire story about the promised land. And one has to be very careful about proving it or making a good case for it, because actually the Quran is not very clear about why the Arabs conquered Jerusalem or what they exactly wanted to do with Jerusalem once they had conquered it. Sabios and the Jews, of course, were of the opinion that the Arabs wanted to rebuild the temple for a third time, I guess, or whatever. The Arabs knew what they were doing. As I said, they were not only anti-Monophysite, also anti-Chalcedonian, except Jerusalem, which I mentioned is this exception because of the Trisagion. But they wanted to have something completely new. They wanted to have their own sanctuary there. And of course, Abd al-Malik built the famous Dome of the Rock, which is one of the most famous sanctuaries that the Muslims possess. And one should not mix it up with a temple. It was a sanctuary that possibly could have been a pilgrimage center. Gerald Hawting, whom you should also, by the way, interview if you have a chance. Hawting. He has recently written a very interesting article where he wonders whether the Dome of the Rock wasn't supposed to be a pilgrimage center competing with Mecca that was barely existing at the end of the 600s. You remember, 692 is the earliest date when Mecca was mentioned. So Hawting is also onto something very interesting in this whole origin of Islam debate. And Sabios, by contrast, even though the scholarship, of course, of Thompson is extremely important and valuable, Sabios can be interpreted in quite a few different ways than he was proposing.
Wow. Okay. So that would be a little contrary to Shoemaker's apocalyptic approach, saying that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So you don't think that Muhammad was like an ends day prophet thinking that the end was going to happen?
No. That is indubitable. But,
okay.
But there you are now.
I was thinking that the mission, there's this mission concept that he talks about this, or at least it's in line with what we've seen with Crone and Patricia Crone and Cook and
Michael Cook, yeah.
Right. And then of course Hoyland had he's not so sure. He's very open to being not sure about anything. But it seemed to me when I read some of this literature where it talks about the Saracens or the Ishmaelites and the Jews are going to conquer together. It seemed like they had some type of almost like here's our contract. We have a contract to capture Jerusalem. And then there's some apocalyptic, it sounds like apocalyptic, but it could be what I think Shoemaker thought was a copy of Joshua's conquest, this idea of going up and conquering Jerusalem again. And it lists like the 12 tribes of the Ishmaelites.
That's Sabios, yeah.
Okay. So you think that's a complete fictional...
yeah, that's entirely fictional.
Okay.
Now, Shoemaker is perfectly correct by saying that the motivation for the conquest, although we have indicators of that motivation only from the 634 onwards, so not the early period after the establishment of Muhammad, of the preacher in Medina. But Shoemaker is perfectly right. At that time, in the 630s, the Arabs were driven by the idea that the world would come to an end soon, because that's, after all, what the Quran is all about. The world will end soon. We hear it still today.
Like the Hadith says, I did this, see the gap between my finger? That's how close.
Right, exactly. And but of course, on the other hand, the Quran, the unnamed preacher is very careful. He never says it will happen tomorrow. It will happen very soon. Now, there you are entering something again new that is very important to take in, and that actually is something that Shoemaker, in my opinion, didn't consider sufficiently, and that is the Quran up to 622 is actually a Quran that preaches, yes, the end of the world, and is also opposed, of course, to the mushrikun, those associators who think that next to God there was also a divine Jesus.
So that means different versions of Christianity, obviously.
Exactly. So that the entire early period prior to 622 was a peaceful period. So the preaching of the end of the world was, be patient. Let me help, the unnamed preacher, let me help to spread the message, because yes, if the world ends tomorrow, you don't want to sin anymore. You want to repent. You want to ask God for forgiveness. You want to enter the kingdom of God when the eschaton, the end, comes. And that, of course, will be accompanied by horrible events. And we all know what these various earthquakes and splitting of the moon and whatever else there is. So Shoemaker is perfectly all right. That's what one calls eschatology. Mm-hmm. But where Shoemaker is not entirely clear, it was only in 622 that the peaceful preaching, okay, you cannot hit people over the head and force them to believe that the world will end tomorrow. All you can do is preach it peacefully and hope that the people to whom you preach it will be persuaded by what you are doing. And that is actually the great mass of verses in the Quran. Only in 622, when Muhammad established himself in Medina, and that we know, 622 is a firm date. It's externally verifiable. The Nestorians are the ones who delivered the documentation for us, to us for this. Only then jihad was preached. And this is extremely important. There's a German scholar who made his name in analyzing the great prophets of the Old Testament, Carl Friedrich Pohlmann, Pohlmann, who just about 2-3 years ago wrote a very important book by saying the Quran actually consists of two major elements: the peaceful preaching, which makes up the great mass of the verses, and then in 622 the preaching of holy war, which is mostly concentrated in surahs 8 and 9, and that was a fateful event in hold on just a moment.
You're fine.
Let me double check something that my wife just gave me.
Listen, I've got a wife as well, and
okay, she gave me some important information. Okay, so Pohlmann therefore then said we have to presuppose that in the Quran that was formed essentially between the years, or up to the years, let's say the 660s, 70s, or whatever, that was the period when the composition of the Quran took place. So after the conquest, when nobody knew anything about the Arabs, that's the time when the Quran came together. That during that time, there was a fierce struggle between the so-called peace party and the so-called jihad party. And we can identify verses in the Quran where the two directly clashed. There is one, let me get my glasses and want to be sure that everybody knows about this. It's Surah 48, verse 4 and verse 74. If you read these two verses, you have a direct proof of the peace party, verse 4 in Surah 48, clashing with the end of the same Surah, 48:74, where the exact opposite is being said. What is being said in these two verses? The first one is, God will be pleased if you continue preaching, essentially. The last verse means, or close to the end, 74, means God will only be pleased, you will be a good Muslim only if you go on jihad. So there is a direct clash in the Quran. Pullman makes the point, there was a peace party, a jihad party, and they were battling it out during the years roughly 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, until we have the first signs that there was a Quran in formation, probably in the 680s. Now, back to Shoemaker. Shoemaker considers only the jihad party. He does not consider the peace party in these whole events. And we should not presuppose that the peace party disappeared just because there was a jihad. And that's the important consideration that one needs to have when one deals with the alleged promise of Jerusalem to the conquering Arabs, replacing the Jews and the Byzantines.
Real quick, when you mentioned the final compilation, if we will, of the Quran, what do you do with the palimpsest, the lower text? How do you address dating these? And I guess you would disagree with some of the others on this.
No, you're well informed, by the way. Thank you for asking me about that. That is, of course, the period then the 680s, which I mentioned, when now we know it through carbon dating, although carbon dating always has the spread of years. You can never really decide.
It's like exactly 50 plus or minus or something.
Exactly, yeah. So let's say around the 680s. There is an upper text and a lower text. But I don't think that the discovery of these two texts has added terribly much. Yes, there are two versions, and there is eventually, of course, also an accepted version, but the discarded version, so to speak, in the palimpsest is not that different.
Right.
And so we have to say that probably much of the Quran was in existence at around that time in the 680s.
Okay. Let's move on to something else. And I got a couple more questions for you, if you don't mind. We have a modern day map of Iraq, and we can see that there's a Yathrib there as well. If we add up everything, do you think the original locations of Mecca and Medina are up in the north in the region of Iraq? Here is that map just to kind of show. You probably won't be able to see the text. Really small print here, but it is very north. It's like up there toward Iraq. Did you want to make a quick comment on that? Do you think that...
No. There are often repetitions of particular names that appear in various places.
Okay.
So that is very unlikely. So we can be, I think the Quran is pretty clear here, and also the early sources, because the Quran are Christian sources, because we don't have Arab sources from the 600s. Medina is very clear. It's mentioned, Yathrib, sorry. Medina is, of course, the Islamic name for the same city, the city of the Prophet.
Right.
Medina al-Nabi. So Yathrib is an old oasis. We have reports about Yathrib in existence already, early Persian Empire, etc.
Right.
So there's no doubt about that. So Medina is well established, and that it emerged as the place of jihad preaching. You see, that's where we only get hold of this unnamed preacher calling himself 4 times then in the Quran in the context of jihad. The name Muhammad appears only in these verses of surahs 8 and 9 that deal with jihad. So the Quran is really split here in the sense. One wishes one could divide the Quran into the peaceful Quran and the jihad Quran and say, okay, the true Quran is the peace full Quran, the one that preaches and does not call for holy war. Medina is well established, and even though Yathrib, of course, could appear also in other places, that's very unlikely that we should take that seriously.
Right.
But also the point now concerning Mecca, since Mecca was not known to have been in existence, Mecca is, of course, the Quran is the beginning of this. Houting is very much of the opinion that this whole transfer of what Jerusalem is or was for the Jews to Mecca. So in other words, it's a pilgrimage place. One circumambulates the sanctuary in Mecca. One runs between Safa and Marwa back and forth because one repeats or commemorates Hagar's search for water for the young-born Ishmael, and so on. That is, of course, a conscious transfer of everything that once took place in Jerusalem to Mecca. And that is, of course, the Islam that we know today. That Islam, however, is not the Umayyad Islam of the 600s and 700s. It's the Islam of 750 and the Abbasids, who then made Mecca the center of Islam. And they are the true creators of the Islam that we speak about today. So, but at that time, jihad was long over.
Right. Okay, this is interesting. Some people say that Muhammad is a title like Caesar is to the Roman emperors, and that Muhammad is not his real name. Muhammad means the praised one, as you said, and his real name is shown in this hadith. So I'm going to pop up this hadith. I'm going to try and read this small fine print. This is probably not the best version of it. Let me get the highlighted version here real quick. Let me do this. Sorry, forgive me for 1 second while I get this actual version that has the highlight, because I want people to be able to see what I'm doing here. Okay, I got this, and I am about to pop it up here now. I actually went and added the highlighted part to make it visible for anybody who's watching this podcast to be able to see. It seems pretty obvious to me there's something going on here. Okay, so I'm just going to read the lower part here, and I might butcher names here. Abu Sufyan then added, when Heraclius had finished his speech and had read the letter, there was a great hue in the Ori in the royal court. So we were turned out of the court. I told my companions that the question of Ibn Abi Kashba, the prophet, Kamsha, the prophet Muhammad has become so prominent that even the king Bani al-Asfar Byzantine is afraid of him. And this is in a hadith. So is that another name for the prophet Muhammad?
Yeah, the red-skinned people, the Bani al-Asfar. Okay. That is the so-called Islamic tradition.
Right.
The Islamic tradition began probably in the 670s, 80s. Again, we are talking here about decisive events at the end of the 600s, where we then have sources that we can be talking seriously about. So at that time, we are talking there now about a generation of people after Muhammad who are maybe the grandchildren of the people who lived at the same time and were his companions of Muhammad, or maybe the great-grandchildren. Now, we cannot presume that those grandchildren, great-grandchildren, remembered anything accurately.
Right.
Even if they were serious and did not want to invent. Now, we have to bear in mind, of course, there was great competition among the people who, when they were conquering, to be the most glorious, the most victorious, the most successful, what have you. And so this so-called Islamic, this Islamic tradition that came into being is extremely unreliable. We cannot determine what is genuine and what is not, what is invented and what might be serious. Yes, there are esteemed colleagues in the field who say, well, in cases where the traditions contradict each other and where later traditionists went with, let's say, one version and rejected the other, that the rejected versions is perhaps closer to the truth. Well, to a degree that is debatable. But overall, the Islamic tradition is extremely unreliable. And this whole business about Abu Kabsh is merely one example. There are other names as well that were allegedly given to this unnamed preacher. But we have to bear in mind that the Quran, you see, this is one of the very attractive parts of the Quran. The Quran deliberately is vague about anything historical. So when I mentioned a little earlier this business about Petra being the place where the first revelations happened, the Quran uses the word al-Qara, which literally means mother of the villages or mother of the towns. Now, officially, the Islamic tradition, later than Islamic theologians, said, oh, yeah, no, that's a clear reference to Mecca. And so ever since, still in modern scholarship, it's believed that that means, that particular verse in the Quran means Mecca. Well, Petra was conquered by the when the Romans conquered and defeated, conquered Syria. They conquered, of course, also Petra. And shortly after that, in 114, I believe.
114 of the Islamic?
No.
Or you're talking about 114 AD? Okay, because that's
AD.
Two calendars here. It's like
right.
Okay.
At that time, so this was after the Romans conquered, of course, Palestine.
This is before
Jerusalem
the wars
in
in 130 or whatever. This is in between the wars that are happening in Jerusalem. Okay.
It was customary for the Roman emperors to give elevated titles to some of the cities that had been conquered in the Roman Empire. So Petra received the title of metropolis. Right? If you translate metropolis, it means martyr polis, polis, mother of the cities. And that's exactly what the Quran says. In technical terms, it's a kalk, as we say. So in other words, the unnamed preacher took the name of Petra, mother of the cities, translated into Arabic, and that's what Petra is. There is another indication that actually we are not wrong. It's not a misinterpretation, because in other verses, there appears the word Rakim. I don't know whether anybody has mentioned that to you.
I don't know about it.
Raqim. It's allegedly the name of the dog of the at the entrance of the cave. In accompanying the so-called Seven Sleepers, the Church of Ephesus. You are aware of
I
the
know
legend?
about this, yes.
Okay, yeah.
There's got to be a genetic, mimetic connection between the Quran and the earlier Christian tradition.
Right. So the, in quotation marks, real cave is in Ephesus. So there we are, way north in Anatolia. There are indications that the Quran, as it exists, wanted to move the Seven Sleeper story to, or wanted to be known, it was probably already the case, that this particular cave was actually in Petra or near Petra. And so Rakim is actually the name for Petra in Aramaic. So you have an indication here, because Rakim is mentioned in the Quran in conjunction with the cave in which the seven sleepers were, as part of the inscription of the names of the people who were in the cave. And unfortunately, there are Islamic scholars, Griffith, for example, who believe that this inscription scholarly, but de facto, Rakim was a well-known ancient name for Petra. So there you have another element that indicates that we are talking about the so-called peaceful Quran being revealed in what I call Madian or Palestina Tertia, until in 622 the preacher turned up in Medina, and ultimately then in conjunction with the beginning conquest, took on the name Muhammad, the praised one.
Ooh.
So that
This
would
is
be the story.
amazing. Okay, last thing here, and
Okay.
and then I just have a couple questions as I let you go here. Some people suggest Ibn Abi or Kasha, the word,
Captcha, yeah.
is another form of the individual in Tabari, Volume 5. And if I may show that here, the first words there is obviously it's written in, it seems a different language in particular, the way it's pronouncing this. But as governor over all Hira and the other former territories of Al-Numan or Numan.
Yeah.
So I didn't know if you thought they were the same person or
No.
if that was okay.
A very different one. Kisra is, of course, the name for Khosrow II. Nu'man was the last Lakhmid king. And that's an interesting little detail. When the Romans cut down the Ghassanids and made them lower level defenders, so to speak, of the Byzantine Empire, although not so low that they wouldn't be still faithful and help Heraclius in the reconquest. Okay, so when Khosrow saw that the Romans had done that to the Ghassanids, he decided, well, I don't need the Lakhmids either as kings there on my western border. They are pretentious anyway with the title king, so let me get rid of these guys as well. So he poisoned or otherwise killed, we don't know exactly, Nu'man, who's mentioned in what you showed me, that particular passage in Tabari. And that happened in 602. The Lakhmids were outraged about this and went and immediately rose militarily against Khosrow. Took quite a while for Khosrow to be until he ultimately was able to defeat them. And it was only then in 610, so 8 years later, that he was quite successful. But then there was yet another Arab revolt. And in 610, they inflicted a defeat on the Persians, on the Sassanids. That particular defeat is reported only in Tabari, so Islamic tradition. We are not absolutely sure. Tabari has to be read with extreme caution. So we don't know whether this uprising really occurred, or this victory by the Arabs over the Persians really happened. But Tabari, and then also a Christian source, actually, the Chronicle of Se'erd, say this 610 was the beginning of the preaching career of the preacher in Mecca. In Medina.
Yeah.
So you have an interesting connection there between the Persians, Sassanids, and the Lakhmids, and so on, in the early 600s, and the alleged beginning preaching career of this unnamed preacher in 610, allegedly in Mecca, but we don't know because we have proof of anything happening down there in Mecca, Medina, only in 622 when the Arab kingdom emerged.
All right, so let's recap for a second.
Okay.
As there's no more images. There's just recapping.
Okay.
What we see is Christianity in its various forms. The wrestling point is on Jesus. I wish I had all these images I've used in Robert Hoyland episodes to pop up to get your thoughts on. And I've done this with Shoemaker, and I've done it with Michael Penn. And I really delete all of this stuff when I'm done. And then I, redo something for other scholars to get your thoughts. But what I understand is this, when I wrestle in my head, I've heard theories that people try to say, well, there was a version of Judaism or a Jewish Christianity that escaped when all that happened, kind of like what we see with the Ebionites, etc., right? And they survived all the way through history, all the way down to 7th century. And I'm thinking to myself, that's a little tough to accept. All the academics I talk to say, no, that's not the case. Most academics deny that outright. There's no Jewish Christianity that survives for 7 centuries down in. But I always ask myself, the Ishmaelites, those who are from Hagar, or Hagarism, as you know, Crone talks about. But the Hagars and the Jews together are like uniting under certain fronts, but Jesus is in the picture. And by this time, Jews don't seem, from what I understand historically, big fans of Jesus. In fact, he's blamed all throughout the Talmud for why the temple's destroyed. I mean, at least in certain locations, depends on the rabbi you talk to.
Yeah.
So I thought, why is Islam obsessed with having Jesus in the picture? I can't see how a Jew practicing Judaism would even venerate the guy or even bring him in. So it makes better entrance if I were to try and find a causality that it was some form of Christianity. Right. And there's even Fred Donner. I emailed him to try and get a hold of him. I haven't got a response yet. He has this hypothesis there's multiple monotheistic groups that are probably under one umbrella or something.
Yeah.
What do you think of that? What do you think of some of this stuff?
Hoyland is very skeptical, and in fact, most of the people in the field. Donner developed a thesis in 1994, actually already, which is actually built on. Are you familiar with the Yehuda Nevo, who wrote an important study of early Islam? Okay, he's dead now, so you cannot interview him. But Donner developed the thesis according to which these years of 640, roughly, let's say, or 638, the end of the Arab conquest to, well, we were then talking about the end of the 600s, which is this big black hole, so to speak, where we don't have any Arab sources and where we have to rely on the Christian sources. Donner's argument there is precisely because there are no Arab sources, because the Islamic tradition is so doubtful. And he's willing to admit that now. And in an earlier phase of his career, he actually worked almost entirely with Islamic traditions. So he argued now that these 50 years roughly, this half century that is the black hole, was the period of an ecumenic Arab conquering society. So in other words, there were these Arab conquerors, but they did not think anything about Monophysites or Nestorians or Jews.
Right.
They simply let all of these communities practice their religion freely. They enrolled them even, no questions asked, in their army and administration. All they required was to recognize the caliph and to subscribe to the idea of the unity of God, the oneness of God, which of course then ultimately was the central thesis in the Quran. But there is no proof for it. We don't know. There is no source. Yes, the conquering Arabs made freely use of Christians and Jews who wanted to participate in the administration, or in the case of Christians, the Ghassanids in the army. And that doesn't prove anything about what they believed or didn't believe. And in fact, you see, there are, in my opinion, there are very important details which one can prove. I'm thinking of 3 examples that I just demonstrated stand against this idea of ecumenicism, I guess one would have to call it. Not at all. There were fierce confessional clashes during this time. So the Umayyads, who eventually emerged in the mid 600s, participated lustily in all of these discussions about who Jesus was. Was he divine? Was he not? Was he put on the cross or not? So everybody at that time was sort of vaguely of the opinion that the Arabs were some sort of Christians. John of Damascus in the early part of the 700s was still of the opinion that they were Christians, but heretical. So that was sort of the gist of it in the 600s. And Donner, I don't think did very well. And actually, this thesis has not gotten very far. Shoemaker is a great supporter of the thesis of the ecumenic form, but he is very concerned to make this whole Arab conquest, eschatological end-time empire, so to speak, sound like it is a logical evolution of jihad, which is doubtful in my opinion. But
yeah, so rather than it being like the way it seemed was, and I'm painting it in my head that they were united. They were united at first. They got along. Everybody's under the umbrella. We're going to go conquer Jerusalem against these, what we call Orthodox Christians, but they have a Trinitarian. There's all sorts of stuff going on. And they're like, no, we're going together. And there is some strange things that I thought were interesting. Maybe you interpret the data differently, is like there are tombs facing Jerusalem. There are, from what I understand, even the prayer was facing Jerusalem initially, and that changed later. Like this idea that, and this gets into that question I asked them, if you don't mind addressing some of these facing Jerusalem ideas, but also just one caveat I want to add to that is the idea is that they're getting along, they're facing Jerusalem, they have a mission together, and then something happens in this community where now they have friction. So the Islamic narrative has Muhammad die in 632. And I've actually had Muslims engage and go, why would you say 632? Why would you say later than 632? Our Islamic sources say he died in 632. And I'm like, well, should we trust those or not? And the question is, are there Christian sources that seem to say he was alive during the conquest of Jerusalem? Was Muhammad alive? This has been like a recent discussion I've had on some of the episodes. There's like 11 or 12 sources. What some of them are probably later, like you said, but is this, they were united under the front, and even Muhammad was going to lead them as this apocalyptic figure, thinking we're going to rebuild, and this is going to like bring the empire idea, as Shoemaker talks about, that's going to cause the greatest empire, and God's going to come down from heaven, and it's going to establish heaven on earth and the whole nine. That's what I had in mind when I was interviewing them. But you make me want to get a whole new canvas and like get a brush and like repaint it, starting from theological disputes within Christian communities. I don't know. There's so many questions I have. It's just, where do we go?
Yeah. Okay. So since we are coming to the end of our discussion now, the whole question of the direction of prayer hangs together, of course, with the whole idea: is Mecca the place where the center of it all is, or is Jerusalem this place? And that was a debate that took place in the 600s, and it culminated actually then in the period between 685 and 705, which is the period of Abd al-Malik, the famous caliph. And it is under this caliph where we have the first inklings, really, of Islam, the famous inscriptions in the Dome of the Rock. Mm-hmm. So yes, controversies about is really Mecca the center, or is Jerusalem the center? And that was carried out then in the course of the 700s. In fact, you see, it was even unsettled in 750, and that's the main reason why the Umayyads were overthrown. Because the party that emerged at that time, the revolution in Iraq and Iran, and which brought the Abbasids to power, was a revolution to make Mecca the center. And the whole negativity that the Abbasids then subsequently developed towards the Umayyads. And then that's why there is now the scholarship on the Umayyads to rehabilitate them, so to speak. Hoyland is a great promoter of this idea. All of this has to do with these fights in the emerging Islamic tradition, the emerging Islam, over the proper direction of prayer, the proper way of performing all of these rituals. We didn't touch, for example, on the parallel and competitive pilgrimage with Mecca. That's the pilgrimage to Arafat and Mina, these are places outside, and that's where the famous throwing of pebbles against the devil occurs, about which I'm sure you are familiar.
I've heard of it.
Yeah. So these are all elements that belong into this long struggle, which then evolved once Abd al-Malik was beginning to create the institutions that we call, okay, that's Islam then in around 700.
Man, I can't tell you how much I definitely want you to come back, Dr. Von Sivers.
What?
I really enjoyed this. And for those who don't know, be sure, please go check out the video. You want to hear the lecture he gives. This is at BYU Kennedy Center. Really, really interesting. Just getting into this. I like your approach. It's very hands-on and it kind of puts the focus on what was really going on at the moment. It's not this satellite view guessing game of, are these Ebionite Christians who, no, this is like what's going on the ground at the time. And please go check out his academia.edu website. If there were any final words you'd like to tell our audience before we go, because I want you to come back. I don't want to burn this bridge.
Okay. What I want to say is, keep reading the Quran, keep believing in the Quran, but become aware that jihad in the Quran is a relatively minor segment, mostly in the beginning of the Quran, and not accidentally, by the way, in surahs 8 and 9. But the rest is peaceful preaching, and it's not conquest. And so when it became conquest, it was a conquest to make Islam superior among all other religions. That's what the Quran says explicitly. So it's not the Arabs who should be victorious, but it's the faith that should be superior to the others. And it's also not proselytizing, because if you conquer, you cannot proselytize easily. You subject people, you don't preach to them. But the most of the Quran is actually preaching peacefully prior to 622, and I assume it began already in the early 600s or thereabouts in, as I said, Madiano, Palestina, Turcia, so way northwest in Petra. That's what perhaps Muslims who are open to rethinking their faith should think about. So I'm not attacking the Quran at all. It is a very important scripture, but I read it for reading about what is it, what I should do with my life when I have to think tomorrow is the end of it. Well, we are in a political situation, by the way, where the world can end, and where we have to think about a tactical nuclear bomb exploding over Warsaw, perhaps, and nuclear stuff raining over all of Europe. We don't know. The end of the world is not something that we can easily dismiss as a thing that will not happen. So that's what the Quran is really about. We should take it seriously, and that is not something that we should poo-poo.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, your information, and never forget, ladies and gentlemen, we are MythVision.